My name is Dr. William McCoy, and I'm the director of the Rutland Institute for Ethics. And I am very happy to have all of you here. We will have others that will certainly join us online. Some others may even walk in late, a little later on, but we're really happy to have you here. For those of you that are here and need to provide some evidence of being here via picture, I encourage you at the very end to come and take a picture with our new assistant director and also our professor that is also here. Without further ado, this is the start, the very beginning of the TIDE conference. Now you'll have to excuse us as we're actually changing our venue a little bit this year and trying some new things out, a little different than what we've done in the past. So we're actually running concurrently virtual and in person. So we're really happy we have an audience here and we have an audience virtually. Any questions that you have, please jot them down. There will be time to ask questions. And without further ado, we're going to ask Dr. Scott Brim to come and introduce our speakers.
Hey there. I'm pleased to announce that we have maybe two speakers. Is Alice with us, Jackie?
Yes, she's in.
Okay, it's good. So I want to introduce Dr. Alice O'Toole at the University of Texas in Dallas. Her specialty is perception, memory, and cognition. And her previous student, Dr. Jackie Cavazos, who studied under her, and their research was about racial bias in facial recognition systems. So the official title of their talk today is Understanding Bias in Human and Computer Face Recognition.
And I think we might have just lost Jackie. Did we just lose Jackie?
She'll be back.
Okay, because she has the slide. So while we're waiting to get Jackie back, I'd like to thank you all for the opportunity to speak with you today. We've actually been studying face recognition bias both in humans and machines now since, believe it or not, 1991 was the first paper we had on bias in machines. So Jackie is going to talk about work she did in my lab to look at really the most recent face recognition algorithms and take a hard look at what they do well and really what they do badly and the biases that result. So she is actually going to give the entire talk. She has the slides, and I'm here to, make comments, add points in different places, and hopefully join in a discussion. I don't know if it's common in these venues to have a discussion, but I think this is a topic that obviously makes us all really think about technology in ways we don't usually think about it. And I hope the perspective that Jackie and I will add today also makes you think about the biases humans have, and also makes you think about comparing human bias and machine bias and looking for solutions that yield the fairest and most accurate, accurate contributions to face recognition. So do we have Jackie back, or should I? Should I just continue to talk till we find her?
You can, Jackie hasn't logged back on yet, but there's something I want to say to our Zoom participants as well as our in-person participants. For those of you who are in person, feel free if you have questions or notes, or you want to jot something down to ask so that we actually can collect your questions and kind of have that dialogue. For those of you on Zoom, if you want to submit questions using the question and answer function at the bottom of your screen, that's going to be the best way to do that so that we can raise those once we hear her speak.
So I'm going to excuse myself 1 second. My phone is texting in the other room and I wonder if Jackie's having difficulty logging back in. So I'll be right back.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much.
So they can't hear us unless we speak into the microphone.
Correct.
So we need to walk up there, ask questions.
Either that or we can pick the mic.
She's saying she got kicked out. So is there like a technical person there who might have a look at that? Or is there a phone number she could call to get reconnected?
She's trying to get back on.
We're hoping Jackie can just log back on. We do not have the technical expertise that you probably are looking for to diagnose why she got kicked off in the first place. But
I have her on the phone here. I can see her icon. Jackie, are you logged in? You just keep getting kicked out. Can you just try sharing your screen? Let's give that a shot. So this is a good startup for the joys of technology. I'm calling California to. I can see your icon, the Jackie, the J for Jackie, but I can't see the slides. Yeah, do you want to email them to maybe to Dr. Braum or
Frame.
Bram? Sorry, I'm
Um,
okay. I've not been kicked out. Looks like just you. And email to me too, just in case if I can run them and you can just, can you talk, like say something on screen? Because did we just lose her icon again?
Yeah.
She just got kicked out again.
um,
She said her internet seems to be working fine, so.
yeah, she can dial in.
Okay, let's have to dial in. Email me slide.
Yeah. But just, she is, I'll just send one.
Okay, where are the slides? Did you send me? Okay, hold on a second. For those of you in the audience, we actually did test this link before the thing started, so I'm not quite sure what the issue is. Yeah, I have these, I think. So let me just put it into slideshow mode. Let me see if I can share my screen. And I wonder if we can get you connected by phone and you can give it that way. Let me see if I can share slides here. All right. Can you guys see slides?
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So what,
Can I forward her a phone number that she could call in on?
yes, why don't you have her call in? She's gonna try and connect one more time. There she's in. Your slides are on, Jackie. I can run the slides. Are you still there? Are you? So unmute yourself. I've got it shared, so let's just go with that, and then you can just tell me next slide. Someone is going to send you a phone number, so maybe you can join by phone and give it that way, and then I'll share slides. Yeah, just get started if you can. Can you actually, can people hear you if you talk?
We cannot hear anything, but we are going to send her a link to dial in. From a
Okay, they're going to send you a phone number to dial in. I'm going to get off the phone, okay?
Okay.
I think we could just hear you, Jackie. Did you say something? Say
Hello?
something? Oh, we
Hello?
can hear you. Yes. Can you
Okay,
see the
can-
slides?
I can see the slides, yeah.
Okay. All right. I'm going to mute and let you get started.
Okay, let's see. If for some reason I get disconnected, I will go and dial. Okay. So computer race.
Okay, I think we should try this by phone. Jackie, you sound like does not sound correct.
Alice, did you say something?
Yeah, I think we're losing every other sentence. So maybe just someone, if they could send you a phone number, it might be easiest for you to join by phone. Not quite sure what the issue is.
Just give us just a second. We are working on sending you the phone number.
Okay. Is she still on? It's hard for me to see if she's on with the slide shared.
If she has Zoom, if she has the capability of getting Zoom on her phone, she might be able to join that way and be able to advance slides. We could advance slides from here.
Right, or I'm happy to do this. So you know what, while we're waiting to get that done, I heard of a version of this talk today. So let me just start with some thought questions, and these are things that we're gonna have you think about during the talk, but let's just begin with some things that would be ethical decisions that would have to be made in lots of different cases, okay? So here's the first one. If a technology is biased, but it's still more accurate than a human on minority faces, do you use it? Okay, that's the first question. The second question is, do you stop using technology until it's perfect? The third question is, do you stop using humans until they're perfect? The next question is, if the technology is more accurate than humans, should it be used instead of humans? Okay. So any progress from Jackie? Or should I just go a little bit further?
I would keep going.
You want me to keep what's
Jackie, is that you?
Did you send her a phone number?
Yes, it appears that we have a panelist who has dialed in, but I cannot hear said panelist. Jackie, are you on mute?
So maybe I should just get started. I could
Hello?
probably. Oh, there you are. Yes, there you are. We can hear you.
Oh my
Can you see the slides at all?
No, I'm completely kicked out of the Zoom.
Okay, but you have a computer, so we're on the thought questions. I put up the thought questions. So if you can,
Okay.
and then just tell me when to change slides. So I went through the 4 thought questions. Let me know when you have your slides up and we'll just go that way.
Okay, I have my slides up, so we can just go that way. So Alice talked about the 4 thought questions, and hopefully this gets you thinking a little bit more about the topic if you haven't thought about it before, especially because when it comes to human and more recently with technology errors in face identification, there's been a lot of debate in recent years on how these errors can affect decisions, especially for minority individuals and in applied settings. So we'll post these questions back up again at the end of the presentation, and we can certainly discuss them in more detail. But hopefully, again, you can think about these as we present the data for today. So go ahead and hit the next slide. So we're going to talk about an overview of the points we'll be discussing today. So first, we'll talk about face recognition flaws and how they impact specifically race in the context of face identification performance for both humans and machines. And then we're going to be talking about how we measure human and machine performance, specifically when we want to compare across the two. Then we'll talk about what are the causes of accuracy differences across race groups in algorithms, and also discuss some considerations to keep in mind when we're measuring these differences. And then finally, we'll end with some final thoughts and considerations on race accuracy variation. So first we'll start off with face recognition flaws. And one thing to keep in mind here is that no single human and no single machine is free of errors. So this might be something here that seems obvious, but it merits some attention here, especially when we think about the variability that there is for humans and for machines when it comes to their ability to identify faces. So sometimes humans are better than machines, and sometimes machines are better than humans. So next slide. When we think about machines and humans and their variability in ability, this is one of the things that we were trying to look at in one of our recent papers. So we were interested in how machines and different range of human ability participated on, or how they did on the same task. So in a face identification task, we compared humans and also algorithms. So we were looking at 4 different algorithms. We also were interested in forensic facial examiners, and these are individuals who receive extensive training to make identification decisions, and their choices and decisions can actually be used to testify in court based on their expertise and their training. We were also interested in facial reviewers, and these are individuals that make quick, less detailed identification decisions. Oftentimes, their decisions lead to investigative leads for police officers. We were also interested in super recognizers, and these are individuals with natural innate ability to identify faces. So they don't have any formal forensic training per se, but again, they have this innate ability to be able to identify faces. Then we were also interested in fingerprint examiners. And so these are individuals who receive forensic training similar to facial examiners, but they do so for fingerprints. So our interest in including fingerprint examiners was because of their forensic training, and we wanted to see if this forensic training generalized from fingerprints to faces as well. And then finally, we were interested in students, and this would provide us a baseline measure of how the general population might perform on this particular task. So here we were interested in looking at how these groups did on a face identification task where you saw images like these. So these images were selected because they are extremely difficult. So the same identity pairs that you see at the top are images that are very similar. They're very alike. They're very different looking images of the same person. The images at the bottom are different identities, and these are images that look very similar, but they're actually of different people. So what did we find? We can see on the next slide that we measured performance for the algorithms and the humans. And on the y-axis, we see this measure of performance as AUC. So I'll talk about AUC in a little bit more detail later, but for now, just note that an AUC of 0.5 is random and an AUC of 1 is perfect performance. So when we were looking at performance, we can see here the the face recognition systems we tested for, and the date on the algorithm denotes the date that they were created. And we can see that with each new generation of algorithm, there was a boost in performance. With this boost in performance, we can compare this now to the examiners. What we see here is a violin plot of the examiner's performance, and we see that each of these black dots represents one examiner, and the red dot represents the median of this particular group. A couple of things that we found really interesting here. One is the degree of variability in the examiner group. So remember that these are individuals that receive high levels of training to identify faces. And we see some examiners perform perfectly with an AUC of 1, and some perform pretty close to random or chance performance, with some as close as 0.55 with an AUC of 0.55. And we see similar results when we look at the reviewers, at the super recognizers, at the fingerprints, and the students as well. One of the main things we see across the board here is that there's a high degree in variability in performance. Again, some of the humans perform at perfect performance and some hover a lot closer to chance performance. So another thing that we really wanted to highlight from this is that the best performing algorithm, the A2017B algorithm, performs comparable to some of the best humans. And it's interesting to note that even some of the humans that receive this high level of training perform lower than even, say, some students as well. So here, kind of the main picture that we wanted to drive home is, again, sometimes the machines are better and sometimes the humans are better, but the algorithms also tend to perform very closely similar to some of the top performing humans, which is not something that we would see 5 or even 10 years ago. So, and go ahead and go to the next slide. When we think about face recognition in applied settings, it's really easy to think about how we can imagine humans making these decisions, right? So humans perform decisions such as passport checks when we go through airport security. And we also can think of humans in things like eyewitness identification. So identifying individuals from a photo lineup or even from a live lineup. However, in more recent years, there has been an increase in use of technology in these settings as well. And so most recently, we've seen that face recognition systems have been starting to be used in airports to try to make face identification decisions from live photographs. We also see that face recognition systems have been used recently to try and garner investigative leads for police officers when making arrests. Next slide. So one of the examples of these investigative leads that garnered a lot of attention was that of Nigeria Parks. So Nigeria Parks was arrested for shoplifting and attempting to run over an officer, and he is pictured on the right. He was arrested based on algorithm facial recognition match that incorrectly matched him to the individual on the left. The individual on the left is actually taken from a photograph of a fake driver's license that was provided by the actual perpetrator. Notably also, he was arrested based on 2 eyewitness accounts that placed Niger at the scene and also confirmed the algorithm's match to the individual on the left. Based on all of this, he was arrested and spent 10 days in jail and spent $5,000 of his own money in legal fees. Fortunately, the case was dismissed nearly a year later, but it wasn't until he was actually able to prove that he was at a Best Western sending money to a relative that his case was finally dismissed. The next slide. Unfortunately, Nigeria's case is not an isolated one. He's actually the 3rd case in the United States to have face recognition systems be used to warrant an arrest. The other cases were that of Michael Oliver and Robert Williams. Michael Oliver spent 2.5 days in jail, and Robert Williams spent a little over a day in jail. Next slide. So when we think about these 3 individuals, there are some commonalities that they share that are worth noting. The first is that these are all Black men. And unfortunately, if we think of the well-documented biases in our justice system, this is not surprising, right? We know that our justice system disproportionately affects Black and Brown individuals compared to other groups. Also, these 3 cases had in common that they had been incorrectly matched by a face recognition algorithm. In addition, all 3 of these individuals were identified by a human eyewitness, or they were identified from a photo lineup. And finally, all 3 of these individuals were arrested. Right. So thankfully, all 3 of these cases were dismissed, but not before these individuals spent a range from a day up to over a week in jail for something that they did not commit. So this is really important to consider when we're thinking about how humans and machines are used in the context of our justice system. But it's important to note that there was an involvement of both the algorithms and the humans when it comes to all of these cases. So next slide. So before I continue, I just want to go ahead and take a pause and do a brief history overview of what got us to this position, right? How have algorithms advanced in the last decade or so? So circa about 2006, the types of images that the algorithms could handle were pretty tightly constrained, only focusing on internal features of the face, such as the eyes, the nose, and the mouth, and not a lot of room for expression changes or changes in viewpoint or lighting. Then at about 2012, the types of images that the algorithm could extract meaningful information from began to vary a little bit more. So we see more variation in background, in illumination, and we see that the images don't need to be so tightly cropped. Then at about 2018, you could really throw anything at these algorithms, and they were pretty good at identifying a face from images. And this included things like changes in expression and even sometimes the face being occluded or covered by other objects. So circa about 2015, right about in between 2012 and 2018, a new generation of algorithms emerged. So you can do the next slide. And these algorithms are known as deep convolutional neural networks, or DCNNs. So DCNNs are modeled after the human visual system, and they work off of multiple layers of simulated neurons. They do so by convolving and pooling image data to create final representations that emerge at the top layer of the algorithm. These representations are really highly compact, and they help us to be able then to measure how similar the algorithm believes two images to be. So one thing to note here is that these simulated neurons work off of lots of training data. So this training data is actually something that has been pinpointed as a potential source for race bias in face recognition systems, because many people point to the training data to be able to adapt the algorithm. But I'll talk about this a little bit more later on. So next slide. Right now, I want to talk about some common myths about race bias and face recognition. So myth number one, there would be no race bias in face identification if we eliminate machines. So a quick look at the literature in psychology tells us that this is not the case because of something known as the other race effect. The other race effect is our greater identification accuracy for own race faces compared to other race faces. So this basically just says that we're better at identifying faces of our own race than of other races. And this has been studied across multiple racial and ethnic groups using a variety of different methodological paradigms. So it's a quite robust finding in the psychological literature. So here, human performance is also affected by race. So doing away with machines isn't going to eliminate the problem because humans also have this problem. Next slide. Myth number two, face recognition systems used to be fair before 2015 and the emergence of DCNNs. So here, a quick look at the literature tells us this is also not the case. Pre-DCNN algorithms show some form of race bias in nearly all contexts reported, and so do DCNNs. So more recently, there was a report by the National Institute of Standards and Technology that actually did kind of a systematic overview of 100 algorithms, showing that nearly all of them show some form of demographic variation across race groups. So if we look at all of the algorithms reported to date, nearly all of them show some form of race bias. So this is not a novel problem that has emerged with DCNNs. This is something that we see for generations before these DCNNs emerged. Next slide. So myth number three, race is categorical, and we know what these categories are. So what do I mean by categorical here is being able to identify a person. So for example, in the illustration that we see on the right, we are able to categorize individuals and say this person is white, or this person is Black, or this person is Asian. So we will go ahead and revisit this idea later on, but I just want you to start thinking about how we think about race as a categorical construct and how this can pose problems for how we measure race bias. Next slide. So we've talked about face recognition flaws. Now we can go ahead and talk about how we measure human and machine performance, especially when we are trying to compare across the two. So in the next slide, you'll see an example of a human task. This is typically what we would show human participants. They would see two images side by side on the screen, and they would be asked if these are of the same person or of two different people. So feel free to try to see if you can identify if this is the same or different people as well. So with this, participants are asked to respond using a rating scale, much like the one that you see on the screen. And this rating scale could range from sure they are the same to sure that they are different. So 1 to 5. Now, say that you were looking at these images and you thought, I'm going to select a 2. I think that these two images are of the same person. First of all, you would be correct because they are of the same person. But then you would go ahead and move on to the next image and rate those image pairs and so forth and so forth. Next slide. So what this allows us to do is then conceptualize performance by plotting the responses to the image pairs from a different identity distribution and a same identity distribution. So we have two distributions here based on the image pairs, whether they are different people or where they show images of the same person. We can then overlay the thresholds and we can see the rating scales positioned 1 through 5. And say that we're thinking about the rating scales and how the image in the prior slides were rated a number 2, right? So if we think of the rating as a number 2, we can then place the image at a rating scale of number 2, and it would land right about in here for the same identity distribution. So if we would place this same identity distribution here, we can then start to think about whether or not we want the number 2 to be meaningful to then say, okay, everything to the left of 2 will say a same identity, everything to the right of 2, same identity, everything to the left, a different identity. So we need to decide what's going to be our threshold. Where are we going to cut this off, right? So let's say we're going to be conservative and we're going to set our threshold at 3. Okay, so everything to the left of 3 will be a different identity and everything to the right of 3 will be a same identity pair. So what this allows us to do is then go ahead and see that we have an overlap in the distribution, which means that we have some error in our responses. So we have 2 ways that we can be right and 2 ways that we can be wrong. So one way that we can be right is by looking at the distribution that is on the left and saying, okay, there is, oh, I'm sorry, I think.
You go to the right first. I'm trying to do this blind, so same identity.
Sorry, no, I think my screen got stuck on one. Okay, so what slide number are you on, Howard?
25.
25. Okay, can you move to the next slide, please?
Sure.
Thank you. Okay, so we can think of 2 ways of being right and 2 ways of being wrong. So one way that we can be right is we can do a correct rejection of the match. So this would be saying that we have 2 images that are different people, and we are correctly saying that these images are different people. Another way that we could be correct is by having a correct match. So here we would say that these two images are the same person, and we are correct. These are images of the same person, and that's the blue distribution here. One way that we could be wrong is by having a mismatch, and that's the green distribution that we see here. So this is by saying that by having two images of the same person and saying that we think that these are different people. And then the second way that you can be wrong is by having an incorrect match, and that's the yellow distribution that you see here. So this is where we have two images of different people, and we have said that they are of the same person. So when we think of the case of someone like Najir Parks, his case would fall in this yellow distribution here in the incorrect match. Okay. So next slide. So one thing I haven't talked about is how good the person actually is can impact the distributions. So if we think of somebody that is not very good at the task at all, this is what their distributions might look like. They might have a really hard time telling apart which identities are different and which identities are the same from the face images that they see. If they have a really difficult time doing this, then their distributions are going to overlap. Then let's say that you have somebody that is really a little bit better at the task, right? So they're good at the task. This distribution, these two distributions are now going to spread further apart because they have an easier time telling apart different identity image pairs from same identity image pairs. And then finally, if you have somebody that's really good, like say, for example, the super recognizers that have a really high innate ability to identify faces, then you're going to have the two distributions separated almost completely apart, right? So because they're really good at identifying which images are of the same person and which images are of different people. So the ability to tell the differences of images comes even before where we decide to set this threshold or this cutoff. So you see here that now we have these thresholds that are placed at the same position, so that purple line there, and these thresholds are set at the same position, but it's going to give us different performance accuracy for all three of these individuals because their distributions start off at different points. So next slide, we should be on, I think, 28 right now. So we can model a very similar task for the machine where we can have the image run through the algorithm. It will convolve and pull the data and produce a face representation at the end. And then we can do this again for the second image as well, where we will convolve and pull and have a face representation. Using these two face representations that the machine produces, we can then compare these and produce an image pair similarity score. So gain a similarity score here for the machine that's similar to the similarity score that the human will provide using that rating scale of 1 to 5. The next slide. So when we think about measuring performance, we want to do so by taking into account both ways that we can be right and both ways that we can be wrong. So one way to do this is to visualize performance using ROC curves or receiver operating characteristic curves. So that's the curve that you see on the right of the screen. And I won't go into too much detail here except to say, again, this is a way that we can visualize performance. But if we take the area under this curve, this gets us our measure of AUC that I talked about in the beginning with the first study that I talked about. Again, AUC scores of 1 denote perfect performance and AUC scores of 0.5 denote chance performance. Next slide. So when we think of measuring algorithm performance, we can do so by taking two measurements into account. One are measures that are not affected by how you set up the machine. And when I say set up the machine, I mean how the operator decides to set up the machine. This is done so by characterizing the system as a whole, right? So we want to have an overall look at how well the algorithm is doing, taking into account all four of these measures. So one way to do so is to look at things like the AUC scores and the area under the curves and the ROC curves. Another way that we can do this is by looking at the measures that are affected by how you set up the machine, right? So this is actually looking at how the operator decides to set up the algorithm. And this is usually done because we're interested in a very specific point of interest or a very specific point of a threshold that we want to see. Next slide. So if we think of the distributions that we looked at earlier, we know that where we set this threshold is going to directly impact these 4 measures of performance. We see that if we shift the threshold to the right a little bit, we are going to get different measures for all 4 of these. And in fact, we could do something like completely eliminate the yellow distribution or the incorrect match distribution if we shift the threshold as far right as possible to completely remove any incorrect matches. However, if you do this, you'll note that you will eliminate the incorrect matches, but you're also going to dramatically increase the number of missed matches that you have, and you're going to decrease the number of correct matches that you get. But again, this is all set up by the operator and what the point of interest is for this particular scenario. Next slide. So when we are thinking about measures that are affected by how you set up the machine, most of the time when these applications are used in security settings, for example, they're set to only have very small incorrect match rates. So the operator might set this at, for example, 1 in 10,000, so that they allow only 1 incorrect match out of every 10,000 decisions that the algorithm will make. Okay, so next slide. And it looks like my slides froze from here. Let me see if I can. Apologies.
It's the next, what causes accuracy differences across race groups and algorithms?
Okay, so I'll try to do this from what I remember. So, okay, so what causes accuracy differences? So when we think about the causes of race bias in face recognition systems, many times people point to the training data, right? So we can think about the images that are used to train the algorithm and how much it relies on this training data. And so a common thought is, we'll just fix the training data. If you want the algorithm to perform well on a particular group, all you need to do is to show that algorithm more images of the group that you are interested in looking at. However, there's a lot more to it than this. And this is the case because the algorithm is affected by several factors. And one of those factors are things that affect the data. So one of these things could be, for example, the quality of the algorithm's representation. So by this, I mean the actual engineering and the architecture of the algorithm. The way that the algorithm is engineered can directly or indirectly impact the algorithm's representation of the images that it sees. And this can be biased more towards one group or another group. Another factor that's driven by the data is face representativeness. And this is a tricky factor because it really makes the user of the algorithm have to think, are the images that the algorithm is trained and tested on, are they actually representative of the population of interest for the algorithm? So for example, say that you want one machine to be really good at Asian faces. That's the target of interest here. Well, what does that mean, right? Does that include East Asian faces? Does that include Southeast Asian faces or South Asian faces? Really understanding what is the purpose of the algorithm is going to help us understand, did we train and test the algorithm appropriately to represent this particular group? Another example is, for example, Hispanic faces, right? So we know that being Hispanic is being part of an ethnicity, so that includes multiple racial groups, right? If you want an algorithm that's going to be good at identifying Hispanic faces, you need to consider people from Afro-Latino backgrounds, and you need to consider people that might be Hispanic but will have blonde hair and blue eyes. So the other factor that can impact this is quality of photographs. And this one might seem like an obvious one or even maybe a trivial factor, but it's actually really important when we consider how much the algorithm depends on these images or these photographs. So the main idea here is you want the quality of the photographs to be equally good or equally bad across all race groups of interest. What we want to try to avoid is having some photographs that are really high quality for some groups, but then having other groups be poor quality images, like very blurred or large parts of the face being obscured by an object or very far distances where a lot of the details of the face cannot be seen. Next slide. So some of the other factors that we consider are those factors that are driven by the user. And this is something that we've talked about already, but it is thresholds. So we'll take a look at thresholds in a little bit more detail in a couple of slides. But for now, just note that we know that depending on where the operator decides to set this threshold, this will directly impact all 4 of these measures and can directly then impact how we measure race bias. Next slide. So now that we've talked about what causes accuracy differences across race groups, we can talk about some considerations for measuring these race groups. So one thing that we were interested in looking at is how race impacts performance. And we wanted to see how it impacts performance when we consider measures that are not affected by how the user sets up the machine, measures that are affected by how the user sets up the machine, and also how the difficulty of the face identification task could impact measurements of race bias. So in this particular case, we used image pairs that were rated as easy, medium, and hard to try to see if the difficulty of the pairs influenced in any ways how we perceived race bias from the algorithms. So next slide, the data set that we used for this study was taken from the NIST Good, Bad, and Ugly Challenge data set. These images were images that were stratified by difficulty level with the previous generation algorithm. So all 6 images that you see on the screen are images of the same individual. The images under the good panel are 2 images that are considered easy to be able to identify as the same person. And then as you move towards the right, going into bad and then ugly, they get a little bit more difficult to say that these 2 images are of the same person. We used, in this case, East Asian and Caucasian faces because these were the images that we had the most, or these were the groups that we had the most images from. Next slide. So we had 4 algorithms. For this study, we used a pre-DCNN algorithm, a new early DCNN algorithm, a 2015, and then we used 2 newer DCNNs, a 2017B and a 2019. Next slide. So first, let's consider the measures that are affected by how the user sets up the machine and measures that are not affected by how you set up the machine. Next slide. So one of the main things that we found here is that the way that you measure performance matters. Some machines don't look biased with some measures, but they do with others. Additionally, you need more than one measure to accurately assess the algorithm's performance. And this also means that we need to understand that it matters what you're trying to measure. Are you trying to measure the overall performance of the algorithm? Or are you interested in a specific point of interest? So for example, you're only interested in having one incorrect match out of every 10,000 decisions. Next slide. So when we consider the measures that are not affected by how the machine is set up, we can think of the AUC scores. So what you see here is the A2019, the C denotes performance for Caucasian faces, and the A denotes performance for East Asian faces. And you can see that this is the same for A2017B and the A2015 and A2011. Essentially, what we wanted to show here is that when we take a look at the two newer algorithms, we see no differences across race groups, right? So these perform extremely well, and we don't see any race bias here. When we look at the previous DCNN and at the pre-DCNN algorithm, we see some potential minimal differences start to emerge here across race. Then we can also take a look at this, the ROC curves from which the AUC scores were derived. And this again gives us a visual representation of performance. What we see here is that the same colored solid and dashed lines at the top are very tightly overlaid, which tells us that there's not a lot of difference in performance for Caucasian and East Asian faces for the two newer algorithms. But once we move down to the A2015, the earlier DCNN, we start to see some separation here. And this is at the lower bounds of performance, right? So this is zooming in at some very low incorrect match rates. And we can see that the solid blue line and the dashed blue line have a large degree of separation, suggesting a greater performance for Caucasian faces than for East Asian faces. Next slide. So what we can take away from here is that when we look at measures not affected by how you set up the machine, you potentially might see some differences based on race, but we didn't see much for the AUC scores, and we see some start to emerge at these very, very low rates of incorrect match. Next slide. But then we can also consider how measures are affected by where the operator decides to set the machine, so at a very specific point of interest. So what we see here is a threshold function where the East Asian pairs are in red and the Caucasian pairs are in black. Now say that you want to set your incorrect match rates at 1 in 1,000, right? So you see the horizontal gray line. And then this tells us that we need to set our threshold at this specific similarity score, right? So we set the threshold here. But what you see here is that this actually touches the red and the black threshold function at 2 different points. And this is actually going to give you a much, much different incorrect match rate for Asian pairs, that it's going to be a lot closer to 1 in every 10 incorrect matches. If you actually want to achieve the same rates for both race groups, you need to push the threshold further to the right and then set your new threshold for East Asian faces with the red vertical dashed line. What we see here is that this is the case for all 4 of the algorithms. We see that all 4 algorithms need a different threshold when setting these incorrect match rates. And here the degree of separation isn't really what matters as much as it matters that it's a different threshold, right? It requires the operator to think about this in more detail than perhaps has previously been thought about. Otherwise, we're going to run into the problems of having very different incorrect match rates for the different race groups. Okay, next slide. So this is a lot of technical data and information here, but essentially what I want to hopefully get across with these 3 measures is that these measures of race can differ. They are not necessarily guaranteed to converge, and they're going to paint a different picture of how the algorithm is doing. So it's important for the user of the algorithm to understand what they are trying to measure and which measure is more appropriate for their particular scenario and the particular outcome that they're trying to achieve. Next slide. So now that we've looked at these 2 types of measurements, we'll take a look at now the challenge level and whether or not that impacted face identification accuracy. The next slide we see here, this is performance for the good images or the easier of the 3 image pairs. What we see is, again, those same colored solid and dashed lines are pretty tightly overlapped at the top, But once we move to the bad images or the medium difficult images, we see, again, the newer algorithms pretty tightly overlaid, but this degree of separation starts to become really evident for the blue lines, for the blue solid and dashed lines, which is the earlier DCNN that we tested, and not so much for the pre-DCNN. But when we get down to ugly or the more difficult image pairs, this is where we start to see really clear separation between those same solid and dashed color lines. And this is in favor of Caucasian faces. So essentially what this tells us is that these race accuracy differences for the algorithm is most evident as these image pair difficulties tend to increase. So the more difficult the images get, the easier it is to see race bias in this particular algorithm. Next slide. So we should be, I think, on slide 60 now. So I'll wrap up here with some thoughts and considerations from the data that I've presented. So we see that sometimes the algorithm is more accurate than the human, but also sometimes the human is more accurate than the algorithm, right? So it's not a one or all or nothing, right? Sometimes the scenario presents itself where one group is more accurate than the other. So this tells us that it's not entirely the technology, but it's also not entirely the human, because both humans and machines have trouble when it comes to differences in performance across race groups. We also note here that the way that you measure bias really matters. It makes a difference here, and it's important to understand what measurement is needed for that particular scenario. And then finally, factors like image difficulty can impact race performance differences. Specifically, again, the harder the images get, the more difficult they become, the easier it is to start to see some of those race biases emerge. Next slide. So what can we do about this, right? What does all this data tell us? The data tells us here that it's not entirely the technology, but it's the way that we use the technology that can be troublesome, right? So we can think about the technology and how that led to errors like Niger Park's cases, but the way that we are using the technology seems to be one of the driving issues here. It's especially important to understand that the responsibility lays on humans to understand the algorithms that they are using, both their limitations and their capacities, and ensure that they know what the algorithm is intended for and how it can be used appropriately. So in all of the cases that I described earlier at the beginning, the human had the final call, and that's really an important thing to consider. And we also need to consider whether or not that's a good thing. Do we want the human to have the final call? Do we want the algorithm to have the final call? Should any decisions in the justice system rely on human or algorithm's final call of a face identification accuracy? So one thing that I found really interesting with the Robert Williams case is that they reported that with the algorithm's decision to provide a match, this investigative lead report came up with terminology like the one you see on the screen, where it says, this document is not a positive identification, it's an investigative lead only, and is not probable cause to arrest. Further investigation is needed to develop probable cause to arrest, right? So this document comes with almost a warning of, hey, this is not enough to cause somebody to be arrested. This should be taken as an investigative lead. What I think is also really interesting here is if we see that there are errors in the machine and we see that there are errors in the human, should there be this kind of warning sign for human decisions as well, right? We have it for the algorithm, and the important part to note is, are we paying attention to these warning signs, I guess, or to these caution signs of making sure that we don't fully rely on the technology, but does that also mean that maybe we don't need to fully rely on the human as well? And that is something that I think the science is still developing to try to help us answer this in a little bit more clear way, but it's a difficult task to answer here. Next slide. So I just wanted to point to 2 points here where face recognition actually does get it right. So there has been cases reported where face recognition systems are used and there are positive outcomes that come from it. One example is individuals were identified from face recognition systems of where they had an armed robbery in New York of a jewelry store. So 3 individuals stole $4 million worth of jewelry, and the face recognition system accurately identified 2 of the 3 individuals. Face recognition systems have also been reportedly used to successfully help and recover individuals who have been victims of human exploitation and trafficking. So one example of this was from the Regional Human Exploitation and Traffic Unit in Nevada, that where they reported that they used face recognition systems in helping them assisting and identifying humans that were victims of human trafficking. So next slide. So I'll end here with a final hurdle or a final thought, and that's going back to our myth number 3, which is race is categorical, and we know what these categories are. So we know that biologically race is not categorical. It can be quite continuous, and this poses a problem for one of our data-driven factors, which is face representativeness. It's really difficult to ensure that we're using the appropriate faces to train and to test these algorithms if these categories are unclear. So for example, how might an algorithm perform on mixed race pairs? And who gets to decide which algorithm is used for these individuals? This can be the same when we think of things and constructs like gender, right? So if you think of transgender individuals, how do we begin to start thinking of algorithms to answer these problems when we think of these categories, or we think of these groups as being categorical when they can in fact be quite continuous? So this is a problem the field hasn't even begun to really start thinking about, but it's a problem that adds another kind of layer of complication to an already kind of tricky scenario. The next slide. So I put up the thought questions again here just to hopefully again kind of circle back and think about these questions as we walked through the data and how you might respond to these questions, or how you think that officials in the justice system should respond to these questions. So we can come back to these questions as if anyone's interested in talking about them more. For now, I'll move on to the next slide for acknowledgements, and just thank you to the UTD Face Perception Research Lab, in which all of this research was conducted, to its PI and my former advisor, Dr. Alice O'Toole, not only for her help with this project, but for working with me to try to seamlessly do this presentation through the phone and with clicks and stuff. So thank you to Dr. Phillips, Dr. Castillo, and Dr. Chalapa also for their help in the collaboration with these projects. And lastly, acknowledgement to our funding sources. And now we will be happy to take any questions, and thank you for your patience and for sticking here with us as we navigate these issues with technology. Thanks.
Right. Thank you so much for a very informative presentation. It gives us a lot to think about when it comes to facial recognition and some of the challenges that are there that exist with facial recognition. We really want, I can tell you, this is very interesting to me as an African-American male, because it makes sense that some of these issues would occur. And it's good to know that we are thinking about ways to make it better. Are there any questions either online or here in the room?
I have a question.
Yes, sir. Must have
Hey, Jackie and Alice, for doing this. My question is, shouldn't there be, it's a comment really, I'm not in favor of facial recognition systems at all, personally. But it seems like it came down to the quality of the photograph. And if there could be a way of rating these photographs, and if they didn't meet a certain level, then they should be, you know, not used. And so I wondered if there was any, you know, that was in any of the systems that you had looked at or something that other people had recognized.
Yeah, so it definitely came down, I think, when we looked at the good, bad, and ugly to the difficulty of the image pairs, the quality of the photographs. And Alex, you can jump in if you have additional thoughts, but I think that's important to consider when we're thinking of applied settings, because a lot of the times we're taking snapshots or screenshots of something that we see from video surveillance, but we don't really know how well machines versus humans do with images in the wild, right? So when having them directly compared, humans and machines, there hasn't been a lot of tests that have looked at that, and there's still a lot of science to be done around this. And I think a lot of times people think of face recognition systems as kind of being completely done. And there's, again, a lot of science that still needs to be done to testing the algorithms and how they compare with humans. But I think one of the things that that hopefully came through the presentation too is that each algorithm is different, right? Each algorithm is based on its own training data and has its own capabilities. And so I think if you are thinking of a specific algorithm that has the ability to only look at very constrained images, then yeah, maybe you would have a threshold of saying, okay, if the image is too blurred or too this or too that, then you wouldn't be able to use that particular algorithm. But I think one of the points we were trying to also make here is that it's really important to make those decisions for every specific algorithm. One algorithm might be able to handle more of a blurred image than another. Just like one human might be able to perceive an identity better from one blurred image to another. So I think it really comes down to looking at the algorithm individually and deciding whether that particular algorithm that you are trying to use can handle images of that particular quality.
And I might just add to that. I mean, there are two ways the task can be really hard. It can be really hard if, like, you have somebody and their identical twin standing next to each other. These are just two people who look a lot alike, or siblings, or so on. So two different people who look a lot alike. And that was mostly what we did in our experiments, is we try and find pictures of people where they're just very similar individuals who are different people, or just different images of the same person that just make them look maximally different for hairdo or, you know, expression or whatever. The other way it can be hard is, as Jackie says, just blurred images. You know, one of the sources of bias that's been studied is sometimes camera calibrations are not set for all skin tones. They're set for some average skin tone, and some photographs are overexposed and some are underexposed. That's been studied as well. So yeah, I mean, the problem is that the humans and the machines are both affected by this. So Jackie was talking about, it depends on which algorithm you're talking about, but also if you go back to that very first slide, it depends on what human face recognition examiner you've got. And some of those guys are much better than others. And so you can see a case where the judgment of the machine would be far more accurate than the judgment of the person who's been through intensive certification. So yeah, so you have to take into consideration both systems. The human's a bit more of a wild card because, you know, any examiner can be on any case, but if it's one algorithm and you study it very carefully, you might have a better chance of having less variability across different cases.
Any other questions? Any other questions? All right, let's give another round of applause to our wonderful presenters. Thank you so much for being with us. That actually concludes this particular session, and we'll be going into session 2 in about 13 minutes. Thank you so much.